Well, under new legislation agreed by the Cabinet recently, people who pay for sex in Ireland will face criminal sanction. The new laws will also strengthen legislation in other areas like grooming, child pornography and harassment. Organisations including the Immigrant Council of Ireland and Ruhama, which supports women drawn into prostitution, have welcomed these moves. Today and tomorrow, our reporter Brian O'Connell will bring us interviews with two Irish men who regularly pay for sex. Brian, good morning.
Morning, Seán.
What exactly is contained, first of all, in this legislation that's proposed by government?
Yeah, it's legislation that's been mooted for some time. It's important to say this new legislation won't criminalise prostitutes. It follows the Scandinavian example, really, of penalising the buyer but not the seller of sex, Seán. So if you're found guilty of purchasing sexual services, you will be liable to a fine of €500 on the first offence, and then that rises to €1,000 for subsequent conviction. Now, it gets more serious if you knowingly purchase sex from a trafficked person, and there's a penalty there of up to 5 years in prison. Currently, it's interesting, the prostitution itself in Ireland is not an offence, but many of the actions associated with it, such as brothel keeping, soliciting, advertising services, they are prohibited currently.
Right, and this is something we'll be talking about in the coming days, obviously, Brian, but you've been speaking to two men, both of whom, as I say, regularly pay for sex.
Yeah, and today we'll hear from the first of them. I spoke with both men on condition that we don't identify them. Now, the first person I spoke to, he's in his late 30s, Seán. He comes from a big family. He is financially secure, a professional person. He's not interested in a relationship, he was telling me, so he decided to go to escorts first about 4 years ago. Now, I began by asking him why he made the decision to pay escorts for sex.
I suppose curiosity would be one thing, and I suppose I'd outgrown the nightclub scene. So, and I suppose it provided compartmentalised sex, which is the reason I say most people go to see escort. And you kind of realise there's quite a degree of manipulation going on inside nightclubs, particularly after under the influence of drink. And I kind of prefer, if honesty is the right word, the fact that you go, you pay a price, you spend whatever, half an hour in her company, and it's clear cut, and as long as both parties get what they get out of the arrangement, then it's of mutual consent.
And the first time when you went to an escort, tell me a little bit about that experience.
She wasn't impressed by my performance, I can tell you that. It was actually boring. I'll be honest with you, it's an odd thing to be saying, but I actually found it quite boring, and she found it quite boring. So I went to another escort subsequently after that, and it was way better. We just clicked.
So that was 4 years ago, roughly, and since then, how frequently would you
Probably
visit
about,
escorts?
I'd say about once every 5 weeks, once every 6 weeks. I have a couple of regulars, but for me, personally speaking, having good conversations is a big part of it. And as I said, quite often, it would run over time. And I find that the best compliment to my time is that when an escort we run over time, over the hour, and, we're still just talking, chatting away, and she's comfortable talking, chatting away. I see that as a compliment.
And the morality of it, is there ever a point over those 4 years where the thought has entered your head that maybe there's a moral question here?
I've been in Limerick City once or twice, and I have been propositioned by women on the street. You can clearly see in that case that, while I won't say it's coercion, there certainly would be something uncomfortable about that situation. I would just politely decline. The biggest abuse of women in this country is domestic violence. It has nothing obviously to do with prostitution. And there's no doubt about it. I can imagine that a man that goes and abuses his wife isn't going to have a whole lot of respect for a woman selling sex. So there's that angle of it. But I would suggest that that's the very reason why women in prostitution should have the maximum labour and legislation laws available to them.
So he wants the whole thing regularised and legalised. I get the sense there, Brian, that he sees himself almost like a cut above somebody who goes to a nightclub looking for sex.
Yeah, I mean, and we'll hear more from him on that in a little bit. His approach is that he feels that paying escorts for sex is more honest than going to a nightclub, chatting somebody up, drink involved, and then maybe ending up having sex at the end of the night.
But he might find himself facing criminal sanction or being criminalised, or at least his activity would be criminalised if this legislation, if and when it goes through.
Yeah, and as you heard there, he draws this distinction between, say, on-street prostitution. He told me, for example, about that incident in Limerick when he was propositioned, and he felt that there's a difference between full-time escorts selling sex through websites and other types of prostitution. So I asked him then, how can he be sure that none of the women he's met, Seán, have been victims of trafficking?
I can only imagine what the horror is for a person that's trafficked against their will. And I don't believe that a woman who suffers daily abuse, repeated rapes, when you walk through the door can just switch over like that and be as comfortable, natural and as accommodating as, as simple as that. I mean...
Where do you meet the women?
Well, I what I say online or whatever, but usually either hotels in nearby cities.
And give us an idea of the charges.
Back in the Celtic Tiger days, I know that the average one was charging €250 an hour. And when the recession kicked in, it's now about 160. So that's a drop of about 40%.
If the new legislation is passed, what you're doing currently and have been doing, as you said, once a month for the last few years, is going to be considered a criminal act.
From some men, it will deter. But for most men, they're not. Because it's just going to go offline. It's going to evolve like prostitution has in relation to any legislative model.
But if it's, and you're presenting it in a way, it's a business transaction really, and if it's just a simple business transaction, why do you think there is this move to criminalise it?
Prostitution has been framed insofar as it's violence against women, and for most people that emotionally blackmails people and say, look, we're going to support you.
So, Brian, he has an arrangement, obviously. There are one or two regulars, I think he mentioned. He was a bit vague on whether the women he was dealing with were trafficked or not.
Well, he says they aren't. He says he deals with professional escorts, as he calls them, who have profiles online. Those profiles are reviewed by people. So he says that they aren't trafficked. He has a number of women who he calls his regulars, and he goes to them time and time again. Is
he a married man, by the way?
He isn't, and as you heard, he referred to it in the first clip about his attitudes towards relationships and dating. I asked him as well, Seán, whether he's open with his family and friends about this interaction he has with escorts.
A member of my family knows. She's comfortable about it now. So literally a handful of people would know that I visit escorts. But again, there's a whole stigma attached to it. I think if you sell sex, you're considered to be a victim or a loser or a drug addict or you're trafficked, For if you buy sex, then you're obviously an abuser or you can't get laid. The implication being that real men go to nightclubs, they chat up women, they lie to them, and they take them home and have sex from them. That's what real men do.
But you don't just meet women in nightclubs.
Oh, you don't have to, but I mean... And I suppose we're going to more of a society where you can actually hook up online with similar people again. I think part of the reason is, I think that you can go, say for example, an escort may show a number of sexual services that she provides. And if you want to try something that you've never tried before, you're not going to do that someone on a one-night stand. You're not going to do it someone that you met on a website. You're going to go to an escort who does this sort of thing and is comfortable doing that sort of thing.
Do you ever worry that you get addicted to it?
I think it can be very addictive, yeah. I think there's no doubt about it. There's a limiting factor, and that limiting factor is money. And
do you think the longer your lifestyle continues like this, the less likely you are maybe to get into a relationship with somebody long term?
This is probably a place where I don't have an interest in having a long-term relationship, to be honest with you. I don't necessarily want kids.
So when you have an appointment with someone, is it just pure sex for an hour for whatever length of time you've booked that person?
If I always book a 1 hour appointment, and I presume if I brought in a clock from that point of view, I'd say about half time is spent talking, chatting.
And if I could ask you a personal question, in that 4 years, have you had sex with somebody where you haven't paid for it?
Oh yeah, I would have, yeah. But again, that was just pure isolated as opposed to...
And was that sex different to the sex you had before you engaged with prostitutes?
That's interesting. No, it's an interesting question. I'd be honest with you, I felt probably a little bit more guilty with that sex than opposed to... No, maybe it's the fact you hand over a fee, it kind of eliminates your guilt because you feel that, right, she's got money out of me for this hour. But I found in the case of the one-night stand that I had that it was... just bland, I suppose, is the only way to describe it. It was almost like it was just an urge to get out of the system, and that was it.
So that's his explanation there, Brian. Just not surprisingly, some listener reaction. I'll just bring one of those texts. That guy should be ashamed of himself. He is so naive. Of course, those he pays for sex will tell him he is wonderful. Money talks, Brian. And he uses that euphemism, I suppose, going with escorts. We're talking prostitution here.
Yeah, prostitutes, sex workers, escorts.
And he's been doing it now for 2 years, I think you were saying.
4 years. He's been once a month. And I suppose of all the people in Ireland who've ever had bland sex after meeting someone in a nightclub, that's his way of explaining it. The rationale is a bit unusual, but he's quite a good-looking guy. He's quite confident. He strikes me as the kind of guy who wouldn't have too much trouble striking up a conversation with somebody. He's a fairly confident guy, young professional, seems to be doing very well for himself.
Did you, or do you want to tell us, Brian, how you got in contact with them or how you came to get the interview?
No.
Okay, wasn't sure whether you would or not. I suspected I would get that answer. But anyway...
well, finally, let me just say, I did ask him, in his view, Seán, if paying for sex through an escort agency is perfectly normal, as he says, why didn't he want us to identify him?
Well, I suppose it could very well be the residue of our upbringing, that the women who have multiple sexual partners have no self-respect, whereas men who have multiple sexual partners are studs. They're someone to be admired. It's more acceptable to go and have one-night stands than see an escort, because there's something apparently pure about two people using each other for sexual gratification.
So it's because of societal stigma, that's the reason that you prefer to remain anonymous?
It's just stigma, again, that we have with sex and anything else. This debate is generally framed towards, if you pay a woman for sex, because no references are made to male sex workers or transgendered, if you pay sex, you are paying money to abuse her. And that's the truth. And if you argue against us, then clearly you have an issue with women.
So he's very matter of fact, he's quite upfront. Okay, doesn't want his name used, Brian, but equally did not insist that we distort or alter his voice in any way, which leaves him obviously open to being identified by people who know him.
Sure, and as he said to me, I think his sister knows. She had found some postings he had done online on his laptop, and he had a pretty frank discussion with her. He explained his attitude towards relationships, the fact he doesn't want to get married, he doesn't want to have children, and this to him is, as he says, compartmentalised sex that he pays for on a regular basis.
Right, and another text, Brian, from a listener saying, those who say they are trafficked may say this to avoid penalty. These are people who are very shrewd and cunning, and we are very naive to believe them.
Well, he made the point that a woman who is trafficked and being abused every day mightn't necessarily show it. But I think if you're in that situation under threat of violence or intimidation, if you do reveal the fact that you've been trafficked, I think you can be a pretty convincing actor in those circumstances.
And we have someone else then tomorrow, Brian?
Well, tomorrow I have an interview, Seán, with a 42-year-old man, and he says that if he didn't pay for sex, he's likely to have remained a virgin his whole life. And he also has a problem with the legislation as proposed. And we'll have reaction as well from some of the agencies working with persons who have been trafficked into Ireland, as well as sex workers.
Brian, thank you very much indeed for bringing us that interview and that report. Brian O'Connell.
Today with Seán O'Rourke on RTE Radio 1.